Emily, it's that fun time of the year again, or not again, every 4 years, you might say.
Feels like it's every year somehow.
Politics have been a part of our lives for various reasons, with some intensity in the really every year, I would say. But of course, it ramps up in election season. And to make it relevant to the Siege Media podcast, we're going to align elections with content strategy specifically, and just talk through our experiences here and what we've learned, and obviously what might be a little different this year in a especially kind of heated election. But although everyone probably feels quite large. But yeah, starting there, Emily, how should brands navigate the process of content creation? We do a lot of digital PR. How should they think about that as we get closer to that November 5th date?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like the $1 million question right now. I know this is just top of mind for everybody, knowing that we're in such a noisy news cycle, and especially, that's going to keep ramping up as we get closer and closer to the election. So teams definitely need to be very thoughtful about what the end of year content calendar looks like. From my vantage point, I think the good news is that, this is not unique in the sense that every year we do start to see sort of a slowdown in terms of coverage as we approach end of year. And this will, of course, exacerbate that, right? The election is going to make those feelings of, it's hard to get in touch with a journalist. It's hard to get your links built. It's hard to find the resources on your team to execute maybe that hero asset you want to execute just as we get towards wrapping things down end of year. But, we can be strategic about using this time. We know that attention is going to be elsewhere. So what does that mean? And to me and the team, the way we've been thinking about it is how can we restructure content calendars? So we're being thoughtful in this time. I think the most obvious example is after, early October, mid-October, that's going to be kind of the last moments where a timely consumer survey that has nothing to do with the election could get maybe any traction. I don't want to say any, but it just starts to feel like, attention is going to be elsewhere. That's not when you want to be publishing something that has short legs. And so instead thinking about, let's restructure the calendar. Let's focus this time for deep research, trends reports, hero assets, whether they're calculators or interactives, that require a lot of hard work from the team. So instead of focusing on maybe short-term digital PR efforts or short-term content, we're taking this bigger picture approach, less about publishing now, whether for digital PR or content in general, and more so thinking bigger picture.
Yeah, it makes sense. Really, by the time this publishes, which will be, you'll know when you're listening to this when it publishes. You're probably too late.
Too late. Don't know. Yeah.
It's just gonna be maybe in some B2B verticals you could pull off some publishing in early October. So hit publish if you're listening to this with whatever you have in draft, even if it's shoddy.
Yeah.
But I agree. I mean, it just generally feels like we now have a whole quarter that's completely blocked off,
right?
From anything. Maybe it'll pick up a little bit for B2B, as noted, but in consumer verticals, everyone's going to be so wrapped up in this. Although, of course, in consumer verticals, December could wake up a little bit if you're in the Christmas ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great call out too. Is I was saying like mid October, but that's already feeling way too late. And so I think the more that we can keep those dates in mind, and then think, okay, what does that mean for the team, and how can we use this time to collect new data that we can then leverage in post in early 2025. We also know in early January, that's kind of the height of these built out trends reports that are super relevant in B2B and B2C industries. So putting that time towards that really thoughtful data analysis now when we know it's going to be harder to get attention from the media or really just get eyeballs on your content in general seems like the best use of time.
Agreed. And although we're speaking quite negatively about this, there are some verticals where you could see some uplift. There could be extra attention you could garner if you have the guts to go to market, to press as a business and creating something relevant to that election. Of course, our recommendation is not to stretch what you do just to do that, especially in such a important vertical like this, and for such a sensitive election. Generally, the news reporters' sensitivity to authority and trust for you is going to be extra high as well. Like, no one wants to publish something that ends up being factually inaccurate or wrong, especially now. So that will probably be harder and harder to do. But it's possible. You can jump in and do that. And there are certain verticals that may have just non-digital PR effects. Like we looked at an infographic from the Pew Research Center that showed what issues are most important for voters this year. And we don't need to turn this into a political conversation, but the two biggest issues on the list as an average is the economy and healthcare. So those are actually two relatively significant SEO verticals as well. So you could see how they would touch relevant verticals that many people that are listening to this play in. And there are some relevant factors there where you could essentially look at these core issues. We were talking about the fact that capital gains or taxes could hypothetically ramp up search volumes in those times. So there are some potential things you could do there. What are some of those that we often recommend to clients, Emily?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of just thinking about, okay, these are topics that make sense with my industry. How is search habits going to change as we get closer to the election and the immediate aftermath of the election? And so for me, a big thing is like living in Google Trends, doing research there, but also just thinking about your user and what they're searching for, your buyer, your customer, and also just general public. So I think there's going to be lots of questions around taxes, lots of questions around the economy in general. And if it makes sense to cover these topics thoughtfully with fact-based, well-researched content, then yeah, you definitely can be that resource that's ready to go. We've talked as the team too about thoughtful revamps for existing content. That seems like a good way to leverage relevant topics and thoughtfully update them so you can kind of capitalize this on in a way that makes sense for your brand. So definitely ways to leverage this. But in terms of like DPR, that's more so where I start to say like, let's pump the brakes a little bit unless it's that perfect brand fit.
Yeah, and as we're looking at here as an example of that kind of update strategy, if you're listening on the podcast, we're looking at Google Trends, and just a relevant thing to look at in your market for your keyword sets, if applicable, is how they were treated in that same time period. I think it could go one of two ways. One, you'll see a really big ramp up the month prior to the election. So we're searching Affordable Care Act, an issue that is relevant. It was relevant in 2020, and you see a really large spike in interest, really starting September 27th, leading up to that November election date, and then it tails off quite significantly. So you technically were a vertical or someone in healthcare that this was relevant to your business. You could potentially publish at that time. I think a secondary factor to consider, depending on the topic, is just what the long tail would be. So say um, the president who is elected does have policies that increase tax rates. You would expect those tax rate terms, just to learn more about them, to immediately go up because of that kind of impact. So you might want to further emphasize those topics, update them. That would kind of be a longer tail. But if it's regardless of interest, you could imagine there was going to be a month lead up there, which is where probably updating your content September 29th, having that timestamp ready to go, especially if it's a really hot topic, you might want to update as much as weekly with new information. That's probably how you're going to be most competitive for those things from a strategy standpoint.
I love that call out of just thinking about your existing content ecosystem and what could be relevant to update, and then really just deploying resources in that timely manner. I think that's a great way to kind of capitalize on this for sure.
Yeah, one obviously relevant thing here is just the political nature of this. Many brands don't want to have that have conversations on these topics. I think our general recommendation to brands, no matter what side of the fence you land on, is just be neutral, talk about the facts. And I think you can talk about things if you're in a finance vertical. If you're Nerd Wallet, you can talk about capital gains, you can talk about tax rates and not come off as leaning towards one candidate very easily, as long as you just talk about the facts and just make that neutrally minded. And if you do that, I think you have the potential to rank quite well and have some beneficial impacts on your business.
Yeah, it's really just about having the right information like in the right place, ready to go when people are looking for it. So I think too, just thinking strategically and getting ahead. Again, like just ways to make the most of this very noisy cycle that we're in, when it might feel like a little bit overwhelming to start building that strategy.
Yeah, agreed. And a secondary thing from that is not just like updating a month prior, is putting in your internal link architecture a month prior. Like that's further going to give it the boost to rank for these important topics. And of course, that's when we clearly have the signals that this is when users care about that. So that could be more time on site for you, engagement. So independent of ranking for something, we can now use this to like hopefully more intelligently engage our user base as well.
So I know there's concerns, right? Just big events ever in terms of just how to navigate this effectively or just any new thing. But it sounds like you are mostly feeling like positive when done correctly in terms of setting strategy around the election. Like it could be a big win when done right. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as long as you don't jump in and cause brand damage for
Yeah.
yourself, that seems like the big risk. Of course, we all we don't know what's going to come on the other
Yeah.
side of these elections. That makes everyone nervous.
Yeah.
But there's search volume gains at very least. Who knows what the long term looks like? But the short term, hopefully,
There's
it
games.
does seem like there's
Yeah.
some wins
Well, and also
to be
too,
had.
just like staying the course, I think too, with SEO just being such a long game, like that's always made me feel like when these, there are these world events, it's more about that long-term strategy too.
Yeah, and I think I mean it's interesting if anything else, like to have these kind of creative, unique
Yeah.
moments in market, like you want them to be happening for positive reasons, which is a neutral reason. But like I think of coronavirus that happened in the past change how
I was gonna
we do
say,
things.
this is
Yeah,
definitely bringing back, you and I talked about strategy when COVID was first happening and onboarding clients and thinking, how does this shape, this shape our approach? So definitely leveraging different takeaways from big world events, but it definitely seems like no matter what, with the right strategy for the long term, any hiccups are always rebounded from.
yeah, agreed. And yeah, you can learn new things. It's an interesting way to use data to your advantage, and it's going to be a cycle that moves quickly, so that people can stay on top of it. It can be most effective.